Last week I was having to quiet y'all down, and now you're ready for me already. All right, good morning, everybody. Good to be here this morning. If we would make our way to Romans chapter 11, please. We are going to continue going through this great book this morning, and we took three Sundays off of Romans to explore other things, and now we're going to pick up where we left off. And, you know, it's been a while since we've been here, and so we'll try to get our minds back in context, and then again, we'll start looking at chapter 11. Before we do that, let's open with a prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this morning, and we know that just the ability to be here is provided by your grace and by your mercy, and we love you, and we thank you so much for all that you've done for us when we didn't deserve any of it at all. Ask, Lord, that we will always try to think biblically and try to be in tune with you and your ways and your thoughts, and letting our thoughts be your thoughts and our ways be your ways. And we thank you for Jesus, most of all. That's the reason we pray. Amen. Okay, so hasn't been long enough that we really need a complete review of what we've seen, but just remember why Paul is writing, and it was all in chapter 1. He explained it there. He's writing this book to the saints in Rome to display, particularly to the Jews, that the gospel, God's power for salvation to everyone who believes, whether Jew or Gentile, the gospel is not a contradiction of the Old Testament, but rather it is the fulfillment of it. The Jews might feel slighted by God. Chapter 9 and verse 14 implies that they're calling God unrighteous or unjust. They feel like he's deserted them and turned his back on them. But Paul is showing that all these things, the Messiah and the establishment of the new covenant, these were all things that they should have seen coming because they were told of first in their own scriptures. He went on to talk about other things, that we've all sinned and fallen short of God's glory and are therefore all in need of the gospel's saving ability, justification through faith and not by works, not by law keeping, the benefit of being a Christian and being justified by Jesus' blood and walking in the Spirit. And we're here now in chapter 11, which fits into a subsection of the book, I guess you could say. Chapters 9 through 11, as we've seen, are all about Israel. He talks about the Gentiles in these chapters, but he only talks about them to show the Jews that they're now just as much God's people as they are. And now even kind of more so, because the Gentiles attained righteousness by faith, whereas the Jew tried to attain it through law keeping. But he's talking to and about Israel, that they're not saved. He desperately wishes that they were. But that there's a problem with Israel, and it's what we read about. And the last part of chapter 10, God has stretched out his hand to them all day long. He's given them every reason, every opportunity to make that smooth transition from old law to new covenant. He only gave the Gentiles creation as a sign, yet they believed. He gave the Jews creation and his law, yet they still didn't believe. And why is that? Well, because as chapter 10 ends, they are a stubborn and obstinate people. So Paul is trying to use the gospel to soften their hard hearts. Another way you could look at this subsection, which Ken has brought up a few times, is this. Chapter 9 was Israel's past and all the individuals that God used to further his plans for salvation. Chapter 10 was Israel's present. The gospel has been preached to them by by preachers, yet they still refuse to believe. And then chapter 11 is Israel's future, what God has in store for them in the future. And this is what their future is. This is how I'd summarize chapter 11. God has not forsaken Israel. God has not forsaken Israel. We've read of all these awful things about Israel, and it might lead us to believe that there's no hope for them anymore. Paul is going to tell us otherwise, and in this way, he identifies with those prophets of old. Whenever the prophets of the Old Testament would prophesy against Israel, and when they would really just rail against them for all the ways that they're wicked and rebellious, all the ways that they had failed, and even whenever they would tell them that the judgment is pending for them, they would always leave a ray of hope for Israel and say that a remnant would remain and there would be hope for the future. Paul's already alluded to this back in chapter 9. He said in chapter 9 and verse 27, quoting from Isaiah, Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved. That's what we'll see for Israel in chapter 11. Of course, we're not going to get to all of it today. We'll only start in chapter today. We'll get through perhaps verse 6 today, so if I could get someone to read just verses 1 through 6, please.
His people by no means, for I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people from before you. Did you not know what the scriptures say of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets. They have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace.
Yes. All right, we'll stop there. All right, thank you. Any questions or comments through that reading? Any observations that you made? Anything to note from that? Yes, sir.
It's backtracking a bit, but I think if you go back to chapter 9, verse 30, 31, it is the fulcrum for this argument that he keeps laying on layers on and using different methods, different examples, different arguments to push this through. But I have heard, haven't verified this, that Alexander Campbell in debates over between Jewish law and Christianity used these two verses through the whole debate. He never changed. Just this sums up everything. And it says, what shall we say then? The Gentiles that did not pursue righteousness attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. But Israel, pursuing a law of righteousness, did not arrive at that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith. That's the heart of all these things that he keeps putting layers upon layers on and saying, all right, you didn't get that, let's try it this way. Because if you're pursuing a law and claiming yourself to be holy by that law, but are pursuing it because you're pursuing the law for the law's sake, then you're not doing it by faith, and it's worthless. He counts it nothing. And that's what he's using these arguments of saying, that he didn't desert you, you deserted him. Did he turn his back on? No, he didn't turn his back on you. All these little remnants he's talking about are the faithful that are still abiding by God's word in the man that he's talking about, through faith, through the faith of it. Not because saying, you're going to, I mean, I don't know that they would say it that way in those days, but it would be like someone going and saying, you're going to hell because you broke this particular law, and you haven't made any atonement. That was the summation of Jewish life. That's a dead race. And that's what Paul's telling.
Yeah, and he commented that on that here in verse 6. If it's works, it's not grace.
Correct.
If it's grace, it's not works. So got to pursue it the right, or attain it the right way, not to try to pursue it on my own. Anything else? All right, so back to verse 1 here. He says, I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not, for I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. So first question that I had whenever I read this verse is what does Paul mean by cast away, or where he asked if God has cast Israel away, or maybe your translation says something like, has God cast Israel off, or I think ESV, has God rejected Israel? So what do you think is meant by that?
ESV says rejected, so I'm assuming Paul is saying, has God actually forgotten his people?
Yeah.
And he says, no. There's no truth to that at all.
Right. Yeah.
He hadn't forgotten me, is what he said. He
Yeah,
hadn't
that's
forgotten
right.
me.
Remember, Paul has been speaking in terms of salvation. Israel is currently not saved, or at least the majority of them. He said that at the beginning of chapter 9 and chapter 10. And now at the beginning of chapter 11, I think he's still speaking in the same terms, in terms of salvation. So he's saying, so Israel isn't saved. Does that then mean that there is no hope for Israel? Is it over for Israel? Is the future completely bleak? Has God forgotten them? Is God done with the Jewish people? And I think the answer, even though he does go on to answer, I think the answer is also implied in his question. Because he didn't say, has God cast away Israel? He said, has God cast away who? What did he say? Yeah, has God cast his people away? By calling Israel God's people, I think Paul is implying the answer. No, they're his people. Therefore, he hasn't forgotten them, and he won't cast them away. They're his people. Do you really think that he would completely cast his people aside? Remember who these people are to him. These are, again, his people. This is his nation. The Gentiles are again, now just as much his people as the Jews, but the Jews have been his people. He took them and he formed them and he made them his own. He said this about them in Deuteronomy 7 and verse 6. It says, for you are holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples on the face of the earth. These are the people that he took out of Egypt. These are the people that he put up with their grumbling and their complaining. These are the people who he eventually led into the promised land. Go ahead. Oh, yes, it is. That hadn't been on the whole time?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, there you go. It's like if you were to have, an old beat up Chevy that you've had since forever. Say it gives you another problem, and you got to take it into the shop. And the mechanic asks you if you'd rather just give up on her at that point. Maybe you would, but you might also say, I put way too many miles on this old thing to give up on her now. That is, in a sense, how God is looking at Israel. And so the answer seems to be implied in the asking when Paul calls them his people. But even if it wasn't, he directly answers his own rhetorical question. He says what he said more than a few times already in this book. He uses the same phrase over and over again to express that whatever he's talking about is simply out of the question. If you're reading from the New King James, it's certainly not. New American Standard, may it never be. Other translations even say, God forbid. It's not a great translation because it doesn't actually say that in the Greek, but it does get the point across. And as I've mentioned, this is like his way of saying, you could not be more wrong. So it's this emphatic way of saying no. So he brings up the prospect of God having cast his people off completely, and then he says, absolutely not. And so now that he's denied this premise of God having abandoned Israel, now he's going to offer some proof for that. What proof did he give that God hasn't completely cast Israel off to the side in verse 1?
What he uses himself.
Right. Right. I'm a Jew, and he hadn't forgotten me. The proof that he offered was himself. I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. So Paul asks the question, has God completely cast Israel off? And he says, hello, me? Well, he can't have completely cast us off because I'm of Israel. I'm a Jew, and yet I know that he hasn't abandoned me. And then you look at the beginning of verse 2. Verse 2 is kind of an awkwardly constructed verse. The latter part of it really belongs with verse 3. But look at the first phrase in verse 2. God has not cast away his people whom he foreknew. And this, I think, brings out an aspect of all of this that maybe we don't think about too much. God is omniscient. He knows everything. We are not omniscient. We do not know everything. And so we might forget that whenever we see God making a decision or performing really any kind of action, that he can peer into the future and he can see exactly where that decision is going to lead to, what all that's going to entail. So what that means is that whenever God chose Israel, that he knew all that would entail. He knew what Israel would be like. Now, there were times where he almost, got so fed up with them that it seemed like he was ready to give up on them. What comes to mind is when they bowed before the golden calves, and Moses almost kind of has to calm God down and make sure that he doesn't, utterly destroy them. But he knew what choosing Israel would entail. He knew how disobedient and how obstinate and how hard-hearted they would be. He knew how they would react to the gospel. And so, since God foreknew Israel and knew how they would react, it would be sort of unfair if he were to get to this point and be like, okay, well, that's it. I've had enough of them. Maybe unfair is not a good word because he has given them opportunity after opportunity, but he knew that this is where they would be, and so he's prepared for this. He knew how they would handle this phase of Israel's unfaithfulness, just like he knew how to handle all of their other rebellious phases in the past. And this speaks great volumes of his love, his mercy, and his long-suffering. Remember what Jesus said about suffering long with people. He said if someone wrongs you 7 times in just one day, and if they come back and ask for forgiveness, again, 7 times in just one day, what did he say to do each time? Yeah, forgive them. He said to forgive each and every time. That came out of the mind of Jesus, which means that it came out of the mind of God. And that shows us how he deals with us. It shows us how he's dealt with Israel after all these years, suffering long with them and forgiving them every time they genuinely asked for it. The same thing that he'll do for us whenever we're stubborn and when we're hard-hearted too. Scott?
So he uses and you're probably going to cover this, but he uses an example there of Elijah in verse 3, and then in 5 it says, in the same way, then, there has also come to be at the present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice. You think that made them wonder at that time? Who's this remnant? Who are these remnants?
Yeah.
Or do they just think he's talking about Christians? Because at this time, we know there are jealous people. He's chastising them for their behavior and attitude in saying that you coveted something that you gave away. You frolicked it away with your lawfulness.
Right.
And now that God did what he said he was going to do, turn to the Gentiles, and they accepted in faith, you're jealous of them. Well, if they're jealous of them, wouldn't that line of saying he's kept for himself a remnant in modern times, just as he did back in Elijah's? I'd be going, who are these guys? Who's this remnant?
Yeah. Yeah. They shouldn't be thinking it's anyone other than Israel, because he's saying there's a little part of Israel that's still saved, and that he's kept. I would bet whoever the remnant was, probably knew who they were, because they're the ones that are actually going along with what he's actually saying. Yeah. Kim. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Not being complacent. New Testament also talks about leaving these elementary principles and pressing on to maturity. It might be if we think we've arrived that we're just still on the milk and not pressed on. Ollie. Sure. Yeah. In a certain sense, yeah. I think he's talking more about actual people that are living at this time, but he's already talked about Abraham in chapter 4, and he's basically told us to mimic what he did. So, and all the sons of Abraham are those by faith. So, yeah, in a certain sense, for sure. Any other questions? Any other comments? At now, right now? Oh, I think so. I do think so. No, I don't think so because they have been exposed to the gospel at this point, and this is what that's what makes the faithful remnant is those who have left the old law and gone on to the gospel. I think he's specifically talking about Jews here because he's talking about God has not completely cast them off, but there's still a little part of them.
That he's discussing when he talks about the remnant is the Jews, but that would by inference be, say, on the day of Pentecost, those that answered the call,
Right.
those that are hearing the word and answering the call are the remnant.
Yeah.
And they are doing this by faith.
Right.
And therefore, as he's going to go into verse 6, 7, 8, and all that, is grace. It's not by works. They're not just adhering to the law. They're doing it out of faith. And that's, no longer by the basis of works. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace.
Right. Yeah. So the first crop of Christians were the Jews. See that in Acts 2, and also James, maybe one of the earliest writings. He says to the 12 tribes that are scattered abroad. But even though there was those 3,000, those are still a minority among all the Jews. So yeah. All right, let's continue on. Let's look at the rest of verse 2 and through verse 4. Or do you not know that what the Scripture says of Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what does the divine response say to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Anyone have a cross-reference there for verses 2 through 4? All right, so this is found in 1 Kings 19, and what I'd actually like us to do is go ahead and turn there to 1 Kings 19, just so we can see exactly in context what point Paul is making here. And remember what's happening here in 1 Kings 19. This is coming off of the events on top of Mount Carmel, where Elijah proved Yahweh to be God and proved the prophets of Baal that they were full of it. And so he had this incredible victory in chapter 18. He also had finally proclaimed this great drought, which he brought on to be over. So Elijah is on top of the world, but he's brought down from a peak to a valley whenever Jezebel responds to his victory by calling for his life. Ahab was the king at this time, but Jezebel, his wife, seems to really be the one who was running things. And when she heard of him proving God, she should have wrote to him and said, we repent and we return to the Lord, but not so much. Let's look at the text. If I could it's a lengthy reading, but if I could get someone to read 1 Kings 19, verses 1 through 18, please.
Now Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, so may the gods do to me, and even more, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them, but by tomorrow at this time. And he was afraid and arose and ran for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die, and said, it is enough now, O Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my father. And he lay down and slept under a juniper tree, and behold, there was an angel touching him, and he said to him, arise, eat. Then he looked, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake baked on hot stones, and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. So he rose and ate and drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. Then he came there to a cave, and he lodged there, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, torn down thine altars, and killed thy prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. So he said, go forth and stand in the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord was passing by, and a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in an earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire's sound, came that of a gentle blowing. And it came about when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Then he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, torn down thine altars, and killed thy prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And the Lord said to him, go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you have arrived, you shall anoint Hazael king over Aram. And John the son of Nimshi you shall anoint king over Israel. And Elijah, the son of Shaphat of Abel Maholah, you shall anoint as prophet in your place. And it shall come about, the one who escaped from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall put to death. And the one who escaped from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him.
All right, thank you. So again, Elijah is incredibly discouraged, and he even asks God to take his life, as Paul mentioned in Romans 11. And remember from there that Paul said that Elijah pled with God against Israel. He said, I've been very zealous for you, while your people have broke your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets, and I alone am left. That's him pleading with God against Israel. And it seems that he wants God to totally forsake Israel at this point. It seems that he wants God to cast Israel away. Yet what does God say in response? Well, he brings up this concept of the remnant. Again, yet I've received 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. And so Elijah, in his discouragement, wants God to deal with Israel. Yet God says that he has greater things in store from him, things that Elijah does not and cannot know. Keep this in mind. We're going to build on this. We're going to go over to a similar example of this. Go over to Jeremiah chapter 12, quickly if you would. And now Jeremiah can relate to Elijah. He faced as much pain and as much discouragement as just about anybody in the Bible. And the source of his discouragement, along with Jeremiah, was Israel. It was God's people who inflicted this pain on him by rejecting him and rejecting this message that he had from the Lord, and also by inflicting literal physical pain on him too. So in chapter 12, Jeremiah essentially issues a complaint against God. It's not unlike what other godly men haven't issued. Asaph did the same thing. Habakkuk does the same thing. It's why are these wicked people prospering while I'm not? Look at his complaint in chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. He says, righteous are you, O Lord, when I plead with you. Yet let me talk with you about your judgments. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why are those happy who deal so treacherously? You have planted them, yes, they have taken root, they grow, yes, they bear fruit. You are near in their mouth, but far from their mind. But you, O Lord, know me. You have seen me, and you have tested my heart towards you. Pull them out like sheep for the slaughter, and prepare them for the day of slaughter. How long will the land mourn, and the herbs of every field wither, and the beasts and birds are consumed for the wickedness of those who dwell there, because they said, he will not see our final end. So again, Jeremiah asks God why the wicked are prospering, how much longer Israel, Judah is going to go on being this miserable, wicked nation that they are. And now God's response is the rest of the chapter. And we could read the rest of the chapter, but look just at verse 5. The Lord answers and says, if you have run with the footmen, and they have wearied you, then how can you contend with horses? And if in the land of peace, in which you trusted they wearied you, then how will you do in the floodplain of the Jordan? So God doesn't really explain anything to Jeremiah. He doesn't really answer any of his questions. Just like with Elijah, he's not going to reveal his entire plan to Jeremiah. God essentially says, okay, you think this is bad? Wait till you see what's next. You think the struggles that you're having now are tough? There are greater battles and greater trials coming your way. He says, Jeremiah, you've been running a race against other footmen. Later on, you're going to be running against horses. And if you can't handle this now, then how are you going to handle the trials of the future? So what do we learn from Elijah and Jeremiah? That we're going to go through trials, and that whenever we do go through those trials, we're going to want to issue our complaint to God, and we may even want to ask God to end it all right now, but He's not going to get back with us with an explanation for everything. And so the answer that we do get from God through His Word is that instead of giving up, maybe it is that we need to buck up spiritually a bit more. Maybe we have to prepare ourselves for even more trials, while knowing the whole while that God is doing things to bring about a better future. Now, that's not easy. I'm not going to pretend like that's an easy pill to swallow. So it's not easy, but it is biblical. Here's a question, and I'm of course speaking in spiritual terms here, but is this world generally darker now than it was 50 years ago? I think the answer has to be a resounding yes. The world is morally darker than it was before. Things are passable and even encouraged and celebrated now that would have been unthinkable in years past. And we may be like Elijah or Jeremiah, and we may be like God, everyone hates you these days, and I alone am left to serve you. We may get discouraged, and perhaps we might want to assume that God's answer is everything will soon get better. But what we're seeing is that that's not always necessarily true. If we had the ability to speak directly to God today, the answer that we might get might be like what He told Jeremiah. The answer may be that things are about to get worse and not better. You think it's bad now? Stick around and see how things are really going to get. Not a nice thought. Again, not an easy thing to think about, but it's biblical. The answer isn't always going to be, okay, things are going to be better now. The answer may be fortify yourselves because things are only going to get worse before they're better. But we also don't know what good things He's accomplishing right now either. Things are generally worse, but there are also good things that He's accomplishing. Like imagine this, for example. Imagine that God arranged a meeting with you and everyone who has obeyed the gospel in the last 24 hours. And he would be able to point out all these newly saved people and say, look at all these good things that I'm doing that you had no clue about. All of these great things that are happening in other places, but you were freaking out because you watched the news. We just don't know what God's doing, and if He had preserved and perhaps Israel's greatest apostasy, these 7,000 who hadn't bowed to Baal in Elijah's day, is He not still working today? Is He not still doing similar things today? So as bleak as things can get to looking like, let's fortify ourselves because more bad may be on the way, but let's also keep in mind all the things that we don't know. I believe that God is still working in the affairs of men today. So who knows what He's doing in the background now, and who knows what great things He's doing all across the globe that we're simply ignorant of. Any questions, any comments on any of that? Well, I'll go Scott, or Ollie first.
I was just going to say, that's why I appreciate some people in here say with Raul posts almost daily, people being baptized. It's just like, that gives you hope. I mean, you see the news, and, man, it's falling
Yeah.
apart. Everybody's,
Right.
and then you see that.
Yeah, puts things in perspective. Gets you out of your own little bubble. Like this is my world and this is all I know. But there's other things happening that are fantastic. Go.
I remember a sermon that was preached when I was growing up and going through some tough times. And it was a reminder sermon that when we see bad things that seem to multiply, that seem to be getting worse, the darkness is getting worse, we need to keep in mind that that's when God is glorified most. God isn't glorified when everything's hunky-dory. He stands out and shines the brightest against the dark. So it's when things are bleak and darkest that God's glorified. In fact, that's why He lets us hang around. There's no point in letting man destroying himself on this floor. Except that God is glorified in all of it. He's made to be shining brighter about who he is and what he is and what he can do against the dark. You know, and those that paint have the same concept, that you can't show the light from your paintings, all those bright colors and everything, unless you have dark to contrast it. It just won't show up. It'll look wrong. But you put some dark in there and then bring that out, and it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
And that's what God does, is he takes this darkness and uses it for his glory, uses it for his own brightness to shine. We should take that lesson ourselves every day. Because the church, the kingdom, the word all shine brighter against the dark. They're not, even while we're being persecuted, as Elijah was saying, they wiped everybody. Now they're coming to take me. There's no point in going on, God. Just kill me. It was hopeless. And God's like, no, I got a remnant that I saved and will always say to myself that those are worth fighting for. So get up and fight.
Yeah.
And I think that's the message that we have to do too, is that God's never more brighter than when it seems bleakest. You know, when the Soviet Union, some of us with the gray hairs here, we grew up even remembering to dive under decks when we were kids, under those things, right? And how silly that was. Thinking we were going to be blown up at any time. No hope for any kind of peace and everything. The evil Soviet Union, they hated God, would kill people if they worshiped God. Then when the walls fell down and everybody rushed in there, did they accept all of that? Well, yeah, they did. They accepted God in droves until everything was hunky-dory. And then they passed them off just like everybody else. It's in bad times that the harvest is the right.
I've heard it put this way: we need to let God define success. Man, you look at the church in the first century, non-Christians look at them and be like, man, those people are having a tough time. You know, they're getting set on fire, they're getting fed to lions, all these things. But what was it that some of the apostles and disciples said that they had considered it a joy that they were counted worthy to suffer for the kingdom? That's success. It may not look like it.
Martyrs
It
would
is.
sing and praise God as they were dying.
Right.
And stuff, and people were like, wow, that's a weird people.
Right. Ken, you had something.
Look at how dark things are to the privilege of us here in the United States. And I think we look at times like Jeremiah or Elijah. Look at a few that but God removed his protective hand over Israel. Bad things happened. Like in Jeremiah's time. Babylon. I think for a long time, America has had God's hand over us. So to speak. All we have to do is remove it. And we'll get it.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, things definitely could get worse, and you know, when we look around, it almost seems like there's no reason that they won't. Doesn't mean it will. Of course, things are cyclical, of course, but we just got to be prepared for that. All right, I got 10:44 here, and I don't think that's much time to get much more done, and so we'll stop there, and then we'll pick up in verse 5, Romans 11 next week. Thank you for your time, attention, and comments.